Tonight, we are standing at the edge of a question that could define this decade. What happens if NATO is pulled directly into the war in Ukraine? And more importantly, what does that mean for the United States? This is not a distant question. It is not just another headline you scroll past. Over the past few weeks, a series of signals have shown how fragile the line between a regional conflict and a global confrontation has become. Ukrainian drones have reached deep inside Russian territory. Moscow has responded with harsher rhetoric and escalations of its own. NATO members bordering Russia have reported near-miss incidents, military aircraft interceptions, and cyber intrusions on critical infrastructure. Each of these events by itself might seem manageable. Together they form a dangerous pattern, one that points toward a future where NATO is no longer an observer, but an active participant. And if NATO enters, the United States enters. That means American troops, American resources, and American families being pulled into a conflict that could quickly spiral beyond Europe. Stay with me, because by the end of this report we will connect the dots. From battlefield signals in Ukraine to the ripple effects that could hit American homes faster than most people expect. Let's begin with the background, because understanding how we got here is the only way to understand where we may be heading. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, it was described as a special military operation. Moscow expected a swift campaign, perhaps a matter of weeks. Instead, the war has dragged on for years, with both sides locked in a grinding struggle. Ukraine, backed by Western weapons and intelligence, has shown remarkable resilience. Russia, despite heavy losses, has adapted, mobilized, and escalated. What began as a regional invasion has turned into a war with global consequences, reshaping energy markets, shifting alliances, and testing the credibility of NATO itself. For NATO, the central challenge has always been the same: how to support Ukraine without becoming a direct party to the war. Billions of dollars in weapons and aid have flowed from Western capitals into Kyiv. Training missions have been set up in Poland, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Intelligence sharing has reached unprecedented levels. And yet, official statements insist that NATO is not at war with Russia. But here's the reality. The line between support and involvement is getting thinner by the day. Consider this. In recent months, Ukrainian drone strikes have reached deep inside Russian territory, even targeting oil facilities and military bases hundreds of miles from the front lines. At the same time, NATO's eastern flank has become a flashpoint. In Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, officials report repeated airspace violations by Russian aircraft. In the Baltic Sea, Russian naval vessels have come dangerously close to NATO patrols. And in cyberspace, attacks attributed to Russian-linked groups have hit energy companies, logistics hubs, and even hospitals in NATO states. Each incident is labeled an accident, a provocation, or a minor escalation. But history shows us that wars rarely explode in a single moment. More often, they build step by step until a miscalculation pushes everyone over the edge. Think about 1914. World War I did not begin because leaders wanted it. It began because alliances, mobilizations, and provocations created a momentum that no one could stop. A single assassination in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction that engulfed Europe. The lesson is clear. When the margin for error shrinks, accidents can become history-changing events. Right now, the margin for error between NATO and Russia is shrinking fast. And here's why that matters to you. Watching from the United States, NATO is not some distant alliance. It is a treaty with teeth, one that America helped build after World War II. Article 5 of the NATO Charter is clear. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all. That means if a NATO state, Estonia, Poland, Latvia, or Lithuania suffers a direct strike, even accidental, the United States is legally bound to respond. This is not a theoretical scenario. In November 2022, a missile landed in Poland, killing 2 civilians. For hours, the world held its breath, waiting to see if Article 5 would be triggered. It turned out to be a Ukrainian air defense missile gone astray, not a deliberate Russian strike. But the incident was a warning shot. One mistake, one miscalculation, could drag NATO into direct war. And when NATO goes in, the United States goes in. Not with just weapons or aid, but with troops, deployments, and commitments that affect American families directly. That is why this conversation matters. That is why we cannot dismiss these signals as just another headline, because the truth is, the signals are adding up. Ukrainian strikes inside Russia. Russian rhetoric escalating, NATO states reporting violations and provocations, the Ukrainian government pressing harder for security guarantees and eventual NATO membership. Each of these developments might seem separate, but they are not. They are threads of the same rope, pulling tighter, binding the fates of Ukraine, NATO, and the United States together. So as we move deeper into this analysis, keep one question in mind. How many more signals will it take before NATO is no longer at the edge, but inside the battlefield itself? And when that day comes, how fast will the shockwaves reach your town, your household, and your daily life? As the war grinds on, the line between NATO support and NATO involvement grows dangerously thin. Already, NATO states have poured billions of dollars in weapons, training, and intelligence into Ukraine. But if Russia decides that these actions cross a red line, the confrontation could shift overnight. The Kremlin has hinted repeatedly that Western supply lines and logistics hubs are legitimate targets. Imagine what happens if a missile strikes a convoy carrying US-made weapons inside Poland or Romania. Would NATO treat it as an attack? Would Washington be able to step back and say, "This is not our war"? The answer is almost certainly no, and that is how escalation becomes inevitable. Not through deliberate declarations of war, but through the logic of confrontation and retaliation. This is not only a battlefield story, it is also a story of cyber and energy. Russia may not be able to match NATO tank for tank or jet for jet, but Moscow has asymmetric tools designed to hurt where the alliance is most vulnerable. One of those tools is cyber. The United States has already seen what even small-scale attacks can do. In 2021, the Colonial Pipeline hack, carried out by a criminal group with ties to Russia, disrupted fuel supplies along the East Coast. Now imagine a campaign not by criminals, but by a state actor determined to create chaos. Banking systems could freeze. Hospitals could lose access to patient records. Power grids could be shut down in major cities. These are not science fiction scenarios. They are vulnerabilities documented by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. If NATO escalates, those vulnerabilities become targets. Another weapon is energy. Europe has already been forced to rethink its dependence on Russian oil and gas. Sanctions and pipeline disruptions have driven up costs, triggered inflation, and forced governments to scramble for alternatives. The United States has stepped in with liquefied natural gas exports, but the global market remains fragile. A single disruption, a single sabotage on a shipping route or energy terminal could send prices skyrocketing again. And energy shocks are not confined to Europe. They ripple across the world, pushing up the cost of everything from groceries to air travel. For Americans, that means higher bills, tighter budgets, and economic uncertainty, all triggered by a war thousands of miles away. And yet, energy and cyber are only part of the equation. The other part is political pressure. Ukraine continues to push for accelerated security guarantees, agreements that would effectively tie NATO states to its defense even before formal membership. For Kyiv, this is essential. For Moscow, it is unacceptable. And for Washington, it is a trap. Once those guarantees are signed, any attack on Ukraine could obligate a NATO response. In practice, it blurs the line between partnership and membership, between support and direct involvement. What starts as a political promise could end as a military reality. History shows us how dangerous this dynamic can be. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union used proxy conflicts to avoid direct confrontation. But even then, accidents and miscalculations brought the world close to disaster. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the clearest example. Neither Washington nor Moscow wanted nuclear war, and yet, through a series of moves, counter-moves, and misunderstandings, both sides found themselves on the brink. It took factional diplomacy, restraint, and sheer luck to pull back. Today, the same risk exists. Only this time there are more players, more technologies, and more opportunities for mistakes. And the danger is not only in Europe. As NATO faces off with Russia, China is watching closely. Beijing studies every move, every hesitation, every fracture within the alliance. If the West appears weak or divided in Ukraine, the signal to China is clear: a window of opportunity for Taiwan. Already, US intelligence has warned that China is accelerating its military modernization, building naval power, and preparing for scenarios that could involve a blockade or even an invasion of Taiwan. If NATO is tied down in Europe, the United States could face the nightmare scenario of a two-front crisis, one in Europe, one in Asia. No administration, no matter how powerful, can ignore the strain of such a possibility. So where does this leave us? On one side, Russia escalating through rhetoric, cyber operations, and energy leverage. On the other, NATO inching closer to direct involvement through security guarantees, military aid, and forward deployments. Hovering above it all, China calculating its own moves. And caught in the middle, ordinary citizens who will feel the impact not in policy papers or diplomatic statements, but in the realities of their daily lives. The prices at the pump, the reliability of the electric grid, the security of their bank accounts, the presence of National Guard units suddenly deployed overseas. This is the chain reaction of global conflict. It begins with distant signals. Drones over Ku missiles in Poland, ships in the Baltic. It spreads into the invisible domains of cyber and energy. It triggers economic shifts, political promises, and strategic calculations. And at each step, the United States is drawn further in, whether by obligation, by vulnerability, or by the sheer logic of deterrence. The lesson is simple. Escalation is not an abstract concept, it is a process. And once it begins, it is very difficult to stop. For many Americans, the war in Ukraine can feel far away, a conflict happening on another continent. But if NATO is pulled directly into this war, the distance collapses. The consequences land here, at home, with a speed that will catch many by surprise. Let's break down what this would look like. The first and most visible impact would be military. According to the Department of Defense, more than 100,000 American troops are already stationed in Europe, the highest number since the Cold War. If NATO enters the war directly, that number will rise. Guard and reserve units across the United States would be called up for extended rotations. Communities would see their local units deployed not for weeks, but for months, maybe even years. Families would feel the absence, employers would feel the strain. A ripple effect would spread across towns and cities, as the human cost of deployment becomes a lived reality. And if the conflict escalates further, talk of conscription, the draft could return to the national conversation. For a generation that has never experienced it, that would be a shock. The second impact is cyber. Cyber attacks are silent until they strike, and then they are devastating. Imagine walking into your local supermarket and finding that credit card payments are offline, cash only. Imagine logging into your bank app and seeing delays, errors, or limits on withdrawals. Imagine a hospital in your city postponing surgeries because their systems have been hacked. These are not far-fetched scenarios. The FBI has already confirmed that Russian-linked groups probe American networks every day, looking for weaknesses. In a world where NATO and Russia are in open conflict, those probes would turn into full-scale campaigns. Every American household could feel the disruption, not through explosions, but through the invisible collapse of digital systems that power daily life. Third, there is energy. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, gas prices in the United States spiked almost overnight. That was without NATO entering the war directly. Now imagine what happens when the world's largest military alliance and a nuclear power clash head-on. Oil prices could jump by $20 or more in days. At the pump, that means sudden increases that hit family budgets immediately. But it doesn't stop at the pump. Higher energy costs ripple into food, delivery, manufacturing, and travel. The grocery store, the electricity bill, the plane ticket, all rise together. For middle-class families already stretched by inflation, the shock would be severe. Fourth, there is the security climate. A NATO-Russia war would not stay invisible in American life. NORAD and Homeland Security would raise alert levels. More fighter jets would patrol our skies. More emergency alerts would buzz on your phone. Schools might conduct lockdown or shelter-in-place drills more frequently. Local governments would update contingency plans. Siren tests, public announcements, and visible drills would remind Americans that the era of distant wars is over. The anxiety would be real. Stress ripples through communities, shaping everything from mental health to local politics. Add these layers together, and the picture becomes clear. A war that begins in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. It travels fast. It touches military families, bank accounts, grocery bills, school children, and the quiet routines of daily life. And then comes the fifth impact: political polarization. In times of crisis, unity is possible, but so is division. Some Americans would rally behind the flag, demanding strength and resolve. Others would question why their sons, daughters, and tax dollars are being pulled into a European war. Protests could erupt. Social media would amplify anger and confusion. Foreign actors would seize the moment, flooding platforms with disinformation to deepen the divides. The conflict abroad could become a conflict at home, not fought with missiles, but with words, protests, and political battles. This is the real meaning of escalation. It is not a sudden leap from peace to war. It is a chain of steps, signals, and decisions that close the distance between over there and right here. We are already watching that chain tighten. Drones over QE missiles near NATO borders, cyberattacks probing Western networks, leaders making commitments that blur the line between partnership and war. The margin for error is shrinking. History warns us what happens when signals pile up. In 1914, Europe stumbled into war not because leaders wanted it, but because alliances and mobilizations created momentum. In 1962, the world came to the brink of nuclear war, not because leaders were reckless, but because each move and countermove narrowed the options. Today, the same risk is unfolding. Ukraine is determined to defend itself, Russia is determined to respond. NATO is determined to preserve credibility. These three determinations collide, leaving less and less room for restraint. For the United States, this is not an academic debate. It is about whether young Americans are deployed in larger numbers. It is about whether families can withstand weeks of higher costs, patchy digital services, and constant alerts. It is about whether communities remain calm under pressure or fracture under stress. Ask yourself this: if NATO is pulled directly into this war, what kind of America will emerge on the other side? An America that is resilient, steady, and united, or an America that is anxious, divided, and vulnerable? The answer will not come only from the White House or the Pentagon. It will come from households, neighborhoods, and citizens who decide whether to meet stress with panic or with clarity. Crises rarely announce themselves with a single alarm. They build slowly, signal by signal, until suddenly they demand choices. That is where we are now. The question is not just what if escalation happens. The question is, what now, before it does? Preparation is not only about supplies. It is about mindset, seeing the risks clearly, refusing to be paralyzed by fear, and choosing resilience over panic. That is the difference between being swept away by a crisis and standing steady through it. So here is the bottom line. NATO may not want war. Russia may not want NATO's full involvement, but accidents, signals, and obligations are pushing both sides closer to the edge. And when NATO steps in, America steps in, not as a distant supporter, but as a direct participant. The ripple effects will land faster than most households are ready for. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and above all, stay prepared. If you found value in this analysis, subscribe to Red Alert Zone and turn on notifications. In our next video, we will break down how NATO's shifting posture in Europe could reshape American security for years to come. Because when crisis strikes, don't just react, be ready.